Hey class, welcome to the live stream and welcome back after the weekend. I hope you all had a great weekend. And we're hitting this week starting off with the civil rights movement, which we'll get into in a couple minutes. Going to give more people a chance to log on. But I would like to see participation. If you want to comment, feel free. If you can't comment because you don't have a channel and you would like to send me a comment, you can shoot me an email and I'll check to see if my inbox shows a new message, and I can read the comment and answer it if you have a question or something like that during this live stream. So feel free to participate. Don't be shy, and we'll give it another about minute and 10 seconds before we get into the content, just to give everyone that wants to be on a chance to be on during the live stream. Also, just side note, after this week starts spring break, so I'm sure some of you are excited about that. So we get through this week, then we get a week off, a week break, and then we get back at it. About 45 more seconds before I start into the content. All right, less than 15 seconds. We're almost there, everybody. All right, let's get into it. So today we're talking about the civil rights movement, but we're going to be talking about the early civil rights movement. So we're talking pre-Civil Rights Act of 64, pre-Civil Rights Act of 65, and quite frankly, we're going to touch on the very early parts in the 1900s of the civil rights movement. But just in case you want to follow along with the book's outline, I do want to start where the book starts, and that's with one of the most iconic incidents in the civil rights movement in the 1900s, and that would be Rosa Parks. So Rosa Parks, she got on a bus on December 1st, 1955. So she gets on a bus, and buses were segregated because of the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court decision in 1896. So in 1896, the Supreme Court heard the case of Plessy v. Ferguson, and it was about whether or not segregation was legal. And the Supreme Court ruled in 1896 that segregation was legal. They ruled the doctrine of separate but equal. As long as there were what they considered to be equal accommodations given to those who were African American, then they could be legally separated or segregated from those who were white. Now, one thing I do want to point out first, before we even get into how this is going to affect Rosa Parks and millions of people, I just want to say that this demonstrates, as I pointed out when we had our lesson on the Holocaust, that just because something is legal doesn't mean that it's moral, right? Something can be legal and still unethical. So this would be a case of legal but unethical. Segregation is legal, but it's still wrong morally. So just because something has the sanction of law behind it and the force of law behind it doesn't mean that it is the morally right thing. So the civil rights movement is fighting a moral evil that is still legal. So segregation is legal, but it's evil. It's wrong, right? So now we get to Rosa Parks. So Rosa Parks on December 1st, 1955, she gets on a bus, and the busing is segregated. And there were the white seats in the front and the black only seats in the back. And there were seats in the middle where African Americans could sit, but if the bus started to fill up, then they had to give their seat, they had to vacate their seat, and they had to give it to someone else. So if a white person said, "Hey, give me your seat," to a black person, that African American had to get up and move to the back legally. Well, Rosa Parks is sitting, and a white man comes up to her and tells her to move, and she doesn't move. So then that man goes to the bus driver, and the bus driver tells Rosa Parks she has to move, and Rosa Parks won't move. So then the bus driver calls the police, and the police come and arrest Rosa Parks. And this is going to end up causing a mass swell of support in the African American community for Rosa Parks, and the NAA is going to get involved in her case and appeal her case, and that's going to lead to a Supreme Court ruling. But before we get there, we need to go back to the NAACP as early as 1909. So, as early as 1909, the NAACP starts combating through legal channels segregation. So, one of the biggest landmark cases early landmark cases that the NAACP takes on and wins is the case of Norris versus Alabama. So the decision in Norris versus Alabama is that African Americans are allowed to sit on juries. Now, this is important for several reasons, but one of the big reasons it's important is if you have an African American accused of a crime and an all-white jury at a time where racism is rampant, what are the odds of that African American having an impartial jury and receiving a fair trial if no other African Americans are on the jury and there is rampant racism? Probably not very good, right? Well, now because of Norris versus Alabama, African Americans were allowed to sit on the jury. So think about this. First of all, this is less than 100 years ago that this case was decided. All right. So that's a major victory for the NAACP, and it's a big motivator in the civil rights community to keep pushing and decision by decision, case by case, start stripping away all these laws that are oppressing African Americans. Something else earlier than Rosa Parks was CORE, and it's the Congress of Racial Equality. And in 1942, it's founded in 1942, and part of what CORE does is encourage sit-in protests. And this is something that unions had done as far as sit-in strikes. And it was somewhat effective for unions. And so CORE thought that it would be an effective strategy to try. And we're going to see that it's ultimately going to be a very effective strategy in the 1960s. So these are two things that are going on pre Rosa Parks. And now let me just flip the page and we're going to get into Rosa Parks in just a minute. But first, I want to get to one other major landmark court case. And this is probably the biggest court case as far as civil rights is concerned. And that would be the case of Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka. It's usually just referred to as Brown v. Board of Education. So this helps overturn part of Separate but Equal, which is the Plessy versus Ferguson decision of 1896. So Brown versus Board of Education is based around the idea that there's a girl, Linda Brown. Hang on, let me just check. I got some emails, make sure it's not comments here. Okay, no comments yet. Okay, so Linda Brown, she's an African American girl, and she lives really close to a white school. But it's a segregated whites only school. And so, in order for her to be educated, she has to walk several miles one way to an African American only school. And the NAACP helps out in her suit, and she sues, and the Supreme Court rules that that is definitely separate, but it is most definitely not equal. And so they rule that segregation in education is unconstitutional. And therefore, schools are supposed to desegregate or what's called integrate. And while that is the legal ruling and while that is the law, there's going to be a lot of resistance to this in the South. So we see 1935, Norris v. Alabama. 1954, Brown v. Board of Education. And then, while this Southern resistance to integration is going on in the South, Rosa Parks is fighting her own legal battle. All right. So before we get into Rosa Parks in a little bit more detail on how that's going to affect busing, I'm just going to pause, see if there are any comments or any questions. Okay, so let's get into Rosa Parks is fighting a legal battle. The NAACP agrees to take her case and take her on as a defendant and hopefully appeal her case all the way to the Supreme Court. While this appeal process is going on, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. arranges and organizes bus boycotts in Montgomery. So the idea is that if they can affect the economics of the busing system by refusing, if African Americans refuse to ride on segregated buses, then the busing industry in Montgomery is going to go bankrupt theoretically. And the goal is hurt them in the pocketbook so that they'll have to give in. Because that's boycotts usually work that way, and at some point the business is going to be hurting so much it's going to be forced to give in. In the meantime, in 1956, the Supreme Court rules that bus segregation is illegal. It's unconstitutional also. So we see Norris versus Alabama, Brown versus Board of Education, and now with this case, the Supreme Court rules that segregation on busing is illegal. But again, just because you change the laws, it doesn't mean you change the hearts of the people. So there are a lot of people in the South that are very resistant to public schools being desegregated, and they're very resistant to busing being desegregated. And this is going to cause a lot of problems that we're going to talk about tomorrow. The last thing I want to talk about today, as far as victories in the civil rights movement, would be early victories in the civil rights movement, so pre-Civil Rights Act of 64 and 65, would be the Civil Rights Act of 1957. All right, so the Civil Rights Act of 57, it was pushing voting rights for African Americans. Now, the 15th Amendment provided for the right for African Americans to vote. It protected the right of African Americans to vote, but uh, legislation, race-based legislation in the South, things like poll taxes, poll tests, literacy tests, things like that, that targeted African Americans, stripped away their right to vote. And the Civil Rights Act of 57 is trying to chip away at this. And while it's not very successful initially, it is very important symbolically because if segregation is going to change, and if racism in the nation, legal racism in the nation is going to change, then the government needs to be involved in that change since the government was part of the problem. So the importance of the Civil Rights Act of 1957 is the federal government is instituting change. And so that means that the minds in government are changing. That's really important. So this means that the government is open to supporting further civil rights legislation down the road. One other reason why this is important is because it creates the Civil Rights Division in the Department of Justice. So we have a division in the federal government now dedicated to civil rights, and that's a very big step. Now, keep in mind, though, that the Civil Rights Act of 1957 isn't long term, it's not very impactful, but the importance of it is that it motivates people to seek further legislative change, not just challenging in the judicial branch, but actually pushing for legislative change in the legislature. And that's a really big deal. All right, so what I want by way of review today is just to touch on that early civil rights movement, Norris versus Alabama, 1935, that is a major victory, and it energizes the support base for the NAACP. Brown versus Board of Education, another massive landmark decision that overturns part of Plessy versus Ferguson. And then in 1956, the Supreme Court ruling that busing needs to be desegregated is another major blow to the previous ruling of Plessy versus Ferguson. And then the Civil Rights Act of 57 shows that the government is receptive to change as far as civil rights are concerned. And these are all major things that are pushing toward equal rights in America for African Americans. All right. Any questions that anyone has or any comments that anyone has? Okay, well, if not, keep up the good work, everybody. I really appreciate everything that you're doing, and we'll continue this conversation tomorrow. Have a good day.